Well, hello, Duarte. Welcome back to a second look, and we'd like to begin tonight by saying congratulations to Azusa Pacific University. Many citizens in Duarte work at APU, as we call it, and we'd like to say congratulations and thanks for this wonderful display they've been hosting all summer called the Dead Sea Scrolls and Beyond. And it's quite well worth a look. Many of us have gone down from Duarte to Azusa to have a look at it. We want to highlight that marvelous little exhibit tonight, and well, not so little, but just a marvelous exhibit, and to give you a thumbnail sketch of what they were covering. What was amazing was the Azusa exhibit did not stop with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but went on to give us really the whole history of the English Bible. You might say from Israel to the moon, and I'll try to prove that here towards the end of the show. But we will go tonight from the Dead Sea to especially the King James Version of 1611. So the Azusa exhibit, we'll have a picture of some of these things to show you here very quickly. It's been titled The Dead Sea Scrolls and Beyond. There it is, a very fine brochure that was distributed free to all comers, people who could go there. And I joined a lot of people from all around California, and indeed all around the world. And the next picture will show you some of the fragments. What happened was Azusa Pacific was able to purchase 5 fragments of the original Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's your faithful reporter there standing in front of the cabinet where some of these were found, and indeed engendered a lot of discussion and a lot of interest in this city and in the city of Azusa about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, 3 years ago, San Diego Natural History Museum had even a bigger exhibit of some of the bigger manuscripts that make up the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what's this all about? What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Now, when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're talking about the Old Testament. That's important to keep in mind, because later we'll go breezing through the history of the King James to the King James Version, which includes the New Testament, but also the Old. And we're going to show you a shot that we showed 3 years ago. It comes from the Azusa magazine, of the area of the Dead Sea where these scrolls were found. A young Arab shepherd boy, the story goes, looking for his goats, threw a rock into a cave somewhat like you see here at Qumran, heard a clink, was disturbed, went up and found the first of these many clay jars that held 15,000 manuscripts of many writings that went back to the time of Christ and just before. This community we call the Qumran community, hence the title of Azusa's APU Life there, From Qumran to Azusa, which we'll be looking at in review tonight. And so the Arab Bedouin who were looking into these caves were able to discover them. The government of Jordan got involved. The government of Israel got involved. And it was the most important manuscript discovery of all time. What was important about the Dead Sea Scrolls was it began to give us writings from our Old Testament, Isaiah and Deuteronomy especially, but almost every Bible book except Esther. It gave us manuscript copies of our Old Testament books that were 1,000 years older in some cases than the Old Testament manuscripts that the Hebrew people used that now make up our King James Version Old Testament. So here we were able to leap back. I mean, the earliest manuscripts we had to make up our Old Testament go back to 900 AD. How accurate were they compared to some other things we could date from 250 or 100 BC? Well, the consensus was they were pretty accurate. They were well nigh close together to sort of lend a lot of respect to what the Jewish translators had been doing. The Qumran people were not officially responsible for preserving the Old Testament. That was the responsibility of the Jewish priesthood and the Jewish community since. But it was a very remarkable confirmation of what we read in our English Bible from our Hebrew manuscripts of 900. Now we go back from 900 AD to 200 BC. Now I tried to explain that 3 years ago on this program, and we're going to play you a clip, show you what some of the big scrolls look like, the Isaiah scroll in particular, and how zealously Israeli and Jordanian archaeologists have worked to unravel the mystery of the scroll. So here's this film clip from here in DCTV 3 years ago. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, as I said, most of the scrolls relate to books we have in our English Bible, but much older than the manuscript copies that our King James and modern translators use to compose and make up our Old Testament. And especially, of course, is the famous Isaiah scroll. We have a picture of the most well-preserved of the scrolls, found, I think, in cave number 2, if my memory serves me correctly, 24 feet long. This is a picture from National Geographic of the Isaiah scroll, written at least 200, 100 years before Christ. Now, as we'll show you later on, after a little video break here, the Isaiah scroll allows us to compare what we have in our English Old Testament with the book of Isaiah, and it stands up very well. And we will show you what we mean by that. This Isaiah scroll is perhaps the most famous discovery in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The 15 manuscript fragments we have in San Diego. We'll show you some other pieces that have been put together in the process, and I'm sure you will see at least a picture in San Diego at the Natural History Museum of this rather famous building in modern Jerusalem. This is called the Shrine of the Book. And you see on the top left of that picture, visitors, tourists, going up to what looks like a big spin top. It's actually in the shape of a scroll handle, and wrapped around that column at the top left is the 24-foot-long manuscript of the book of Isaiah. And the portion we showed you just before that is the quote I have here from National Geographic from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 9. O Zion, herald of good tidings, lift up your voice with strength. As it says, looking again at that beautiful shrine of the book in Jerusalem, built in 1965 to house most of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the best preserved of all the scrolls. Isaiah was cherished by the Essenes because of its prophecies about the coming Messiah, the war of the children of light against the children of darkness. We're back. We're looking at the 5 fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were on display, still on display, in the month of August here in Azusa Pacific University, or there at Azusa Pacific. And we are making some comments on this and talking about how interesting it was that the people at Azusa had used the Dead Sea Scrolls 5 fragments that they now own as a jumping off spot to cover the whole history of the English Bible. Now, 3 years ago on this show, I mentioned that the Hebrew translators of the Old Testament did not translate sentence by sentence, not even word by word. They translated letter by letter. And they had every middle word of every book computed. They had the middle word computed of the whole Old Testament. It was almost like an amazing computer system that these translators used down through the centuries, down to 900 AD, when the King James translators began to incorporate that Jewish text into our Old Testament. Letter by letter, middle word in this book, middle word in the Old Testament. It was almost, like I said, very sophisticated computer-like technology for the Middle Ages. So that's the Old Testament portion. We get into the New Testament portion, and the best way to start, I suppose, is to show you a picture of the man who translated the first complete Bible, Old and New Testament, that we have record of. And his name was Jerome. He was a Roman Catholic scholar, and he went to the Middle East, into Palestine, and he began to gather all of the Greek manuscripts that were floating around the Roman Empire. Remember, Paul had written to the Corinthians. Paul had written to the people in Thessalonica, up in Greece. And so these manuscripts had been treasured and preserved by the churches. Obviously, they wore out eventually, but they made copies, and the copies were so good that when people made a new translation, they figured the new copy is even better than the old one. Jerome gathered all of these Greek manuscripts, took the Hebrew of the Old Testament, put them together for the first time in between 2 covers, and he called it the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate. It sounds like vulgar, doesn't it? But all It was a good word back then. It just meant common. It was something for people to read. Unfortunately, it was in Latin. But the Latin Vulgate wasn't a bad translation. And of course, there was only one church in Western Europe at that time, the Roman Catholic Church, and that's the one they stood behind. But people began to grow and multiply in Europe, and they began to develop feelings of nationalism and patriotism and national pride. They had all these wars back and forth, the French, the Dutch, the English, the German people fighting each other, the Italians. All of this was going on, and people wanted to have a Bible in their own language. Now, the church at the time, unfortunately, was very much against that. They figured people would get all confused. They needed priests and ministers to teach them how to interpret the Bible. But still, the desire persisted to be able to read Scripture in the native tongue. So in 1381 or thereabouts, a man named John Wycliffe in England was given money by his wealthy supporters to translate the Bible, the first complete English Bible that we had. He's called the father of the English Bible. We have a picture or a likeness of Wycliffe we'll put up on the screen for you here. Wycliffe and the Lollards. They were called Lollards because apparently they were mumbling from the word that means to mumble. And they'd be mumbling, they'd be reciting Scripture to themselves as they walked around and basically evangelized England. The Bible always does that. When the Bible reaches people, it many times results in a change, a transformation. And it's dangerous, the Bible, because it says, blessed are the poor. That's not the way the world is set up today. Bible says, turn the other cheek. That's not the way we run things today. Bible does say also respect authorities in the right sense. So, there you go. Wycliffe, John Wycliffe in 1381 gave us our first English Bible, Old and New Testament. Problem. What do you think the problem was? It had to be written by hand. It was handwritten. And therefore there were very few copies, even though some of them did go into Europe and began to influence people who were thinking of reforming the Roman Catholic Church. Wycliffe's Bible was very expensive. It took years to produce. Today we have a great group of people called the Wycliffe translators. They do things much quicker with digital technology, I assure you. And of course, what happened in the next century after Wycliffe, poor old Wycliffe was always in danger from the church because he was doing dangerous work, and he had some rich people who did protect him, who didn't like the church owning all the great lands of Europe. So they sort of were eager to sort of the loose brick approach, the Jimmy loose, anything that would sort of embarrass the church. So Wycliffe did have support. He was protected by his wealthy lords and nobles. But when he died, his body was exhumed and was burnt and scattered across the nation of England. Bible translation has always been a tough and uphill business. Well, that was 1381 with Wycliffe's Bible. And of course, Azusa Pacific faithfully transcribed all of this on beautiful, big, I have to appreciate the billboards size material they used to explain all of that. Well, what happened was in 1450, we had the very first information explosion. We talk about living in an information age and an age of information. You know, back in 2000, when our century was beginning, there was a quiz or a questionnaire on ABC television about who was the most important man in the last 1,000 years, from 1,000 to 2,000. I voted for Martin Luther, but the winner was a man named Gutenberg. And I said to my wife, even Luther would agree with that, because I hadn't thought of Gutenberg, but Gutenberg is the man who invented movable type, the printing press. We have a little artistic depiction of the first early presses. And I'll only give you 2 seconds to guess what the first book that was printed on Gutenberg's printing press. It was the Bible, of course, 1450, 1455, roughly around there. This begins to really change things in world history. Now we've got access to printed Bibles, can be printed much faster, much cheaper. They can get into the hands of people who study the Bible on their own for the first time. And you know what's going to happen 50 years later. We're going to have something called the Protestant Reformation, this revolution in the heart of Western Europe that still affects our world today. There is a statistic that says that from 1450 to 1500, there were more books in people's hands than for the whole 1,000 years beforehand. It was just an incredible moment in history. So I have to applaud ABC or whatever station it was for saying Gutenberg was indeed the man of the millennium. Because we're living through the internet, the Facebook, the Twitter revolution. In some ways, that was the first real information explosion in 1455. Now we have come a long way from Jerome with his Latin Bible, as good as it was, and it lasted 1,000 years. It held up. It's still around. And we've come from Wycliffe and his handwritten Bible. Now we are able to print the Bible, and we're able to use Greek manuscripts and set up a whole revolution in religion. And we owe a lot of this to the man whose picture you will see next, Erasmus. Erasmus, I did not know till I went to Azusa Pacific, was called by Luther the man who knew it all. The man who knew it all. Something close to that. That was a new thing to find out, because Erasmus really does get an awful lot of credit. He was the first European, he was the first person to take the Greek New Testament from the Greek manuscripts that were flooding into Europe. Something else that had taken place in history, sometimes these things take place bang, 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 and you have a revolution. You had Gutenberg, but you had Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, still around, finally being taken over by the Turks, and all the Greek learning and all the Greek manuscripts, including the manuscripts behind the New Testament, come into Europe. And it was Erasmus's job in 1516, his calling, to put out the first printed Greek New Testament. Now this really sped up the revolution in religion in Europe in this period, because now you could have a printed Greek New Testament. It was a simple matter to go from Greek to English, from Greek to Dutch, from Greek to Italian, or, as Martin Luther would say, from Greek to German. And of course, we know what happened when Martin Luther began to come to his conversion experience and reading the New Testament in Greek, which he was able to do, and reading the Old Testament in Hebrew, which he was able to do, and began to put out a German translation of the New Testament. This was almost the second beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Luther came out with his German Bible in 1522. And this, of course, started this massive religious turmoil in Europe that went on for a couple of hundred years. And a lot of good things happening as well. People waking up to the fact that common people could take communion, not just the priesthood. All of the changes that the Bible clearly showed people, that ministers could marry, simple things like that, that were not really being practiced at the time. And so Luther came out with his German Bible in 1522. Well, you know the English, they can't be left behind if the Germans are doing something. And in 1526, this man, you'll see next, is called the father of the English Bible, along with Wycliffe, a man named William Tyndale, translated from Erasmus's Greek text, a printed Greek New Testament. He began to set us on the road towards the King James Version of 1611. Tyndale came out with an English Bible in 1526. At that time, the King of England, Henry VIII, was very pro-Catholic. He did not like the Reformation. He did not like Luther. But of course, we know what happened with Henry when he tried to divorce his first wife. He began to move into his own religious area. But at this time, 1526, he was very much behind the Catholic Church, very much against this new reform movement. And Tyndale's Greek New Testament had to be smuggled into England in wine casks and feather beds, more or less, so the people could get it in their hands. And of course, when they did, there was a revolution. And for his trouble, not Wycliffe, but Tyndale was actually strangled. He was arrested in Holland, I think it was, and strangled. And when Tyndale was strangled and burnt at the stake in 1535, his last words were, "God opened the King of England's eyes." And not too soon after that, Henry VIII and his divorce problems and trying to marry other wives, he had a good reason for it. He was trying to provide a king for England, an heir to the throne, you might say. And so when Tyndale prayed, Lord, open the King of England's eyes, believe it or not, that prayer was answered much more in short a time than Tyndale could have even imagined. And of course, you had these great commitments by people later on who followed Tyndale, Matthew's Bible, Coverdale's Bible, till finally the English church realized they couldn't stop the tide any longer. So they came out with their own great Bible in 1539, and this begins to sort of form the tributaries, the rivulets that begin to form this stream that leads us to the King James Version of 1611. Not that that's a perfect translation or the best translation, but it's very good. And it also happens to be the best-selling book in the history of the world, and the book most people think of when they think of the Bible as such. So we'll try to take it there. The Geneva Bible came out in the 1550s by a group of people in Switzerland who were called Calvinists. They had a real bias against being told what to do, so they called the king, in their translation, they called the king tyrant. You know, you could use politics in your translation if you weren't careful. The Geneva Bible has sometimes been called the Jesus Church Bible because sometimes it slipped and translated Jesus Christ, Jesus Church. And it also made a mistake in Matthew 5, the Geneva Bible. Matthew 5, it said, blessed are the placemakers. So it's sometimes called the Placemakers Bible, sort of slipping up there in 1560. And this will happen. Translators and translations will make mistakes. But do you think it's easy to put off a mistake in this subject of Bible translation when everybody is watching it like a hawk, when other religions are watching what you're doing? It just is not easy to get away with mistakes in Bible translation. For example, one translation, and Azusa pointed this out, was called the He translation because it called Ruth in the book of Ruth, He. So it's called the He translation. I think my favorite mistake in the Bible is one called the Wicked Bible, because it translated thou shalt not commit adultery. It left out the word not, so it read thou shalt commit adultery. The Wicked Bible, 1561. Well, the English, the Dutch, German, everybody was now into the business of improving and perfecting their translations. Queen Elizabeth was behind the translations of the Bible. She didn't like the Geneva Bible. I mentioned the Geneva Bible because that's the Bible the Puritans used, and that's the Bible that sailed on the Mayflower over here to America, which was pointed out once again by Azusa Pacific. Well, what was happening was there was a proliferation of Bibles. And so when King James took over, when Elizabeth died in 1603, King James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England. He meets with these troublesome people called Puritans who don't like kings, don't like bishops, don't like robes, don't like mitres and ceremonies and crosses. The Puritans and James did not get along. James liked all of the ceremony associated with the church, and they didn't, and they met in 1604, and they just did not get along. Now, on the book God's Secretaries, which we've already showed you, we'll show you again, and there's a picture of King James. That's King James up there at the top left, and that's the translators of the King James Version below him, and we can keep that there for a while because it just reemphasizes how human in some ways some of this process was. James and the Puritans did not see eye to eye. At the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, it was going to be a mess. Everybody's going to go home mad. They only agreed on one thing. Both the Puritans and the king and his bishops agreed that they needed a new English version of the Bible. So the King James Version is based on a compromise between Elizabeth's Bible and a lot of Tyndale's New Testament. And the translators were picked and chosen very carefully, some of the most educated people we have ever had in European civilization. The man who was the chairman of the committee, Lancelot Andrews, could speak 22 languages. He used to learn a new language every summer. He was just brilliant. James put him in charge of the translation. And there were 6 groups of people. 2 of them met at Oxford, 2 of them at Cambridge, and 2 of them at Westminster, next to Westminster Abbey. And they began work on the King James Bible 1608, 1609, and in 1611 we had what is called the Authorized Version, or the King James Version. It has captured the hearts of most of the English-speaking world and is still number one, no matter how many modern translations we seem to put out. And the author of this book, and by the way, don't think I didn't envy this man his title, God's Secretaries. What a great title for a book on translation. He gives a lot of credit to the translators for preserving the dignity and the majesty and the style of the King James Version. It obviously had the King's influence. It's a book that's written with authority. It's a book that has dignity. It has grace. It doesn't have a lot of sneaky references in there. Its consistent attention to a grand and heavily musical rhythm are the vehicles by which that majesty remains in the body of the text. You know, dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. Though I speak with the tongue of men and angels, and have not charity, I am as nothing. You know, all of these great phrases that roll out of blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the peacemakers. This is King James English, which we still use very much to this day. Great book, great title. How I wish I had thought of that title. Well, at least I can do a show on it. That's almost as good. So what we're going to do tonight is to remind you, at the beginning, we said this book goes from Israel to the moon. Thought we were joking. All right, my faithful high school students, let's show the next slide. The Bible that circled the moon. I did not know this, as Johnny Carson would say, until I went to the Azusa Pacific display that's on in the month of August here, and read this about the Bible that circled the moon. This was on the voyage of Apollo 13. The Bible left planet Earth on April 11th, 1970, as a special passenger on the crisis-ridden mission of Apollo 13. It was carried in the form of a microfilm document measuring less than 2.2 inches, a tiny piece of film containing the full text of the King James Bible, all 1,245 pages. This was before Facebook and Twitter. They were doing pretty good, these astronauts. And this particular Bible that Azusa has on display was signed by the Apollo astronauts. So some people said, why not? The Bible came from outer space. We might as well take it out there. You'll remember, some of you, there was a great fuss when the astronauts read from Genesis 1 back in 1968. And someone tried to take them to court, and the judge said, this is out of my jurisdiction. Yes, it's very difficult to deal with a book that's been taken into outer space and back. So that's a little bit of the story of this fascinating book, the Bible. We could talk for hours about all the translations that have come up ever since. And there have been many good ones. I'm not trying to get stuck into the King James mentality here, but just to show you, this is the one that's most well known. For 300 years, it was the King Bible in the English-speaking world, and in some ways still is. So the King James Version has been replaced by even better translations, and better manuscripts have been discovered. There's 15,000 manuscripts out there about our New Testament. Lots of room to compare and make notes. And still, a good place to end our discussion tonight of this fascinating display that Azusa Pacific University has put on. It's July now. It'll go on until sometime in August. I hope you can get out to see it. It's been great to talk about this. I hope you've enjoyed it. I thank my students for being Johnny on the spot with all of these slides tonight. We'll see you next time on A Second Look.